Good morning, Scott here, known as Cantaloupe to some online, and I'm bringing a video to you on a subject that's interesting to me. It might be of interest to you or someone you know. And I have spoken in other videos about symbol abuse and narratives, people who are nihilists and believe as a philosophy that truth is subjective rather than shared between us as an objective reality. And I want to give an example. This is something interesting that I think has an opportunity to be better understood. And that is the case where somebody starts with a foregone conclusion and works their way backwards. It's a type of abuse, and you can prepare yourself for it, and it's very, very common, surprisingly common. You see it in the news. You see it being used by government people and politicians. Sometimes they leverage the idea that everything's an opinion, according to them, and they start, like I said, with a foregone conclusion and work their way backwards. For example, this is something that is very useful in cases where there's ambiguity to begin with, or if it's kind of a questionable gray area or a debatable thing where, like, for example, somebody's in their home. If somebody is, choosing to be naked in their own home, and this is an actual news story that I saw recently where a DoorDash girl pressed charges on a man who was naked inside his own house. She showed up, and he had either a screen door or a glass door, and she could see him in his living room, and she chose to press charges because he was naked, which raises an interesting and debatable question about when and how somebody is being inappropriate, even if they're in their own home. So the answer, if you ask me, as an aside to this particular conundrum, is when somebody's in their own home especially, and probably elsewhere as well, they have the right to their own privacy. They have the right to their own physical protection and safety, and to express themselves however they want, as long as it's consensual and not damaging to other people. So the question becomes, how and why are people seeing them ever? Has there been some kind of form of technology implemented, such as, this woman is now taking advantage of a vehicular system and an employment system to gain access to his personal space, because that's the reality here that a lot of people just aren't seeing or aren't willing to see. She has leveraged technology to gain access to his home visually, and that's relevant in this particular case. But back to the original subject. So this is just an example of how something might not be obvious. The answer to the question of propriety might not be obvious. So somebody who has a feeling about this kind of situation or similar situation might start with their own conclusion and work their way backwards. They might say, well, he's creating pornography then at that point, if she's able to see him. But and then they work their way back. They create a closed system. They say, I'm going to be correct in my assumption, and I'm going to just work my way back until it gets sticky logically, and at which point I'm going to just say, well, I don't want to be adversarial or I don't want there to be a conflict. So they start with their point. They work their way backwards. They don't start with objectivity. They create a closed system for the narrative, and they begin at the end and work their way backwards until at which point there is a contradiction, and then they say, well, I don't want to argue, and they bail out, and they blame the other person. And this is the abuse. This is the whole abuse. It's very simple, actually. So they start with, for the last time, their foregone conclusion that has no support in reality. It's part of an artificial system with a closed boundary around it. And then they work their way backwards logically. They say, oh, well, I'm going to call, like, the situation with this man in his living room pornography, and I'm going to say that she's damaged because she had to see it. And if you question anything beyond that, then you're being argumentative. And then I bail out because I'm calling you argumentative. You see how it works? But the reality is, in conclusion, this shouldn't be a long video. The reality is, there's a bigger picture, right? There's always a bigger picture. There's a context that connects with our world. And there's a reality between us that we all share, and we have to symbolize to communicate. And as symbols, they are subject to interpretation. But to start with the symbol, to say that a perspective out of context is valid out of context, that has some meaning out of context, that's an abuse. This is the whole narrative abuse. It's nihilism in effect, where you assert that everything is an opinion, nothing is true, it's whatever you say, and you start with your own conclusions and work your way backward. And you'll start to recognize this. You will recognize this approach because it's very common, unfortunately. A lot of people use this abuse. Watch out for that. Watch out for closed systems where when you get to that logical boundary, when things start to fall apart because it was never true to begin with, they say, oh, well, you're being argumentative now. I'm out. You're being argumentative. I'm right. And then you have a battle on your hands. If you want to be fair, if you want to be accurate and true, and if you want to be honest, there's a bigger picture that connects with reality, and it doesn't need to break down at the borders. It doesn't need to have a closed system. It doesn't need to only work in one case. It needs to actually be reducible to principles that are applicable and true for everything, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. If you like this video or dislike this video, reach out with questions or comments to whitehotrobot@gmail.com. Thank you.